Romans chapter 1, starting in verse 13. Paul writes, "Now I would not have you ignorant, brethren, that oftentimes I purposed to come unto you, but was let hitherto, that I might have some fruit among you also, even as among other Gentiles. I am debtor, both to the Greeks and to the barbarians, both to the wise and to the unwise. So as much as in me is, I am ready to preach the gospel to you that are at Rome also. For I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ. For it is the power of God unto salvation, to everyone that believeth, to the Jew first, and also to the Greek. For therein is the righteousness of God revealed from faith to faith, as it is written, the just shall live by faith." Now, as we've seen, I think, over the past several months, both not only in the couple weeks we've been here, but as we finish out the book of Acts, Paul had a heart for people. He genuinely cared for, he loved people, he loved the church. There's no questions about this. However, the thing that put a fire into Paul more than anything else was the gospel. That is what drove him to do what he did. That's what led him to be what he was. Paul loved the gospel. He loved sharing the gospel. He felt compelled to tell the gospel. We'll see that here more in just a moment. So he loved the gospel for what it did for him. He loved the gospel for what he knew it could do for others. Furthermore, as we know, he had a unique calling from Jesus to preach the gospel as the apostle to the Gentiles. And so thus we see that even though it wasn't his main reason for his desire to come to Rome, we've seen a couple of things that he said as far as why he wanted to come. It absolutely played a part. The gospel was what drove Paul. And so this is because Paul understands the gospel. And here he begins his lengthy and remarkable explanation of that gospel. As we said in our introduction, righteousness, really the righteousness of God, is the theme of the book of Romans. And that is the heart of the gospel. And so you could say just generally or broadly, the gospel is what the book of Romans is all about. And so we'll really start to see that in earnest with our text this morning. And so here in verse 13, as we start, he gives a little point of clarity. And so he says, "I would not have you ignorant, brethren," which, by the way, that's just something that Paul says from time to time when he really wants somebody to understand something, right? You really need to get this. "I would not have you to be ignorant, brethren, that oftentimes I purposed to come unto you," he says, "but was let hitherto." And so he's already discussed a couple of times his desire to be with them. In fact, he went so far to say, for I long to see you. It was the desire of Paul's heart to be with the Christians in Rome. However, if you were one of those Christians in Rome and you were reading this, you're reading over and over Paul saying, "I wanted to come to you, I want to help you when I get there, I want to depart some grace," right? All these things that he's been saying. You might ask yourself, well, if Paul wants to be here so bad, why hasn't he come? Why isn't he here? And so Paul answers that question kind of almost seemingly before they get asked. And so he lets them know, and again, he really wants them to know, he lets them know that he's tried, but he has been unable. Now, here at least, he doesn't tell us why. There's a passage in chapter 15 where we kind of get an idea. But here he doesn't tell us why. Now, it is possible that it's similar to what he told the Thessalonians. He writes to the Thessalonians in 1 Thessalonians 2. He said, "Wherefore we would have come unto you, even I, Paul, once and again, but Satan hindered us." That's what he told the Thessalonians. And so he specifically told them, "I tried, Satan hindered us." Now, he doesn't go into detail as to how Satan hindered them, but he saw his inability to go to Thessalonica as a direct result of Satan's persecution. He doesn't say that here. What is the most likely reason is that, simply speaking, ministry happened. He was so busy with the things that he'd been doing in the Mediterranean area. And again, this is alluded to in chapter 15. In chapter 15, he had been speaking about preaching the gospel. And then he says in chapter 15, he says, "For which cause also I have been much hindered from coming to you." And so for which cause? Specifically the cause of preaching the gospel. And so it's possible that preaching the gospel stirred up strife and opposition, and he could see that as a similar situation to Thessalonica, that Satan used that to hinder him. But more than likely, it was just simply Paul is, he's a very busy man and just didn't have the time. But that didn't change his desire. His desire was to still be with them at Rome. And so he adds to that. He says, "that I might have some fruit among you also, even as among other Gentiles." And so we don't need to see this as a selfish statement, as a selfish desire, as if the only reason Paul wanted to go to Rome is to see what he could get out of it. That's not what he's saying. Essentially, the fruit that he's talking about is to the benefit of those with whom he's gaining it. And so the fruit would come undoubtedly in two ways. Clearly, it would come by the continued evangelism of Rome. I mean, that's something that Paul did everywhere he went. He would go to Rome, and yes, there were Christians there, and there were churches there, but that does not mean that there were not people who still needed to hear the gospel. And so Paul would go to Rome, and one of the things he would do, as we saw continually throughout the book of Acts, he would preach the gospel. And more than likely, his plan was, of course, events made it so that this was not what he was able to do, but his plan was more than likely he would go to the synagogues, and he would start preaching there, because that's always what he did first when he went into a city. He would go to the synagogues. He would start preaching and teaching to the Jews. Inevitably, what would happen is they'd get to the point where some of them would believe and some of them would get mad, and he'd get kicked out of those synagogues, and at which point he'd start preaching to the Gentiles. That's pretty much what Paul did everywhere he went. And so that was more than likely his plan here in Rome. Like I said, we know he went there in chains. He didn't come under freedom, so he wasn't able to do things how he might have wanted to do. But undoubtedly, the fruit that he would gain would come from one point by the continued evangelism, but also this likely speaks to the ministry of Paul to the Roman Christians themselves. I want some fruit amongst you, not just the unsaved. I want to disciple and further your relationship with Christ. In the upper room, when Jesus is praying in the upper room before going to the garden, he's teaching the disciples, and he tells them this. He says, "You have not chosen me, but I've chosen you and ordained you that you should go and bring forth fruit, and that your fruit should remain." And so this was a command given to the disciples who would become the apostles, and Paul was under this same call, and he made it a point to bring forth fruit. And so I think sometimes, and we're going to see this a little bit more in detail later, but I think sometimes when we think about the aspect of bringing forth fruit, I think typically Christians see that as simply evangelistic in nature. While that's certainly true, we don't need to negate the discipleship factor. And I believe that Paul saw that as very much a part of bringing forth fruit, was not just the evangelizing of unsaved people, but the discipling of Christians. And it's to the detriment of newly saved individuals to get them saved and then just to kind of throw them to the wolves, as it were. Discipleship must happen. And so Paul almost definitely saw part of his trip to Rome being not only evangelism, but also a large part being discipleship. And so Paul's view of why he would seek to bear fruit is interesting. And this is verse 14. He says, "I am debtor." And so this is a very interesting aspect of Paul's, the way Paul viewed his own ministry. He says, "I am debtor both to the Greeks, to the barbarians, both to the wise and to the unwise." And so for Paul, he saw his ministry as if he were under an obligation. He didn't say, this is just something that I like to do in my free time. No, this is Paul's obligation, was to go and preach the gospel and to bear fruit. We've given this verse already in this study, but in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, he tells the Corinthians, he says, "For though I preach the gospel, I have nothing to glory of." He says, "For necessity is laid upon me." And he goes so far to say, "Yea, woe is unto me if I preach not the gospel." And so it's not just an obligation. It was that. But he was saying, I will be cursed if I don't preach the gospel. This is how far he was going to show his obligation to Christ. Now, we know that Paul is called the apostle to the Gentiles. In fact, he's going to mention that later on in chapter 11. He say, "For I speak to you Gentiles, inasmuch as I am the apostle of the Gentiles." He'll say that in chapter 11 of this book. And so he had an obligation in this sense to go because God called him to go. As I said in the introduction, Paul had a unique calling to preach the gospel in that he was an apostle. We all have a calling. It's just not the same as Paul's calling. However, he has the same obligation that we all have, which is to warn the world of the dangers of living outside of Christ. And so Paul had an obligation in the sense that he was an apostle, but he had an obligation in the sense that he was a child of God. And so Paul saw this as something that was absolutely necessary, not just something he wanted to do. That was part of it. And we'll see more of that in just a second. He wanted to do it, but he was under obligation to do this. And so this was an interesting aspect of Paul's viewing of his own ministry. And so those to whom Paul is obligated, he says verse 14 again, Greek, barbarian, wise, and unwise. These four terms, categories, whatever word you want to use for it, these have been variously interpreted as to exactly what Paul meant by this. Likely, what I believe he's referring to all facets of the Gentile world. You have the Greeks and barbarians, which, as we've discussed a little bit, for the most part, at this particular time, people broke Gentiles down into these two groups. You were Greek or you were barbarian. You were Greek, Hellenistic in nature, or you were a barbarian. You didn't speak Greek. You weren't part of that culture. And so they kind of broke the Gentiles down into those two groups, typically speaking. And then on top of that, wise and unwise. I don't think there's much of a discussion here as there is with the Greek and barbarian. But you have the wise, you have the unwise. And so, like I said, he's talking to all facets of the Gentile world. It doesn't matter your station. It doesn't matter your culture. It doesn't matter your language. It doesn't matter your knowledge level. It doesn't matter your IQ. None of that matters. What matters is the gospel, because the gospel is that which puts us all on the same foundation. And so we know, as the book of Acts makes abundantly clear, and based upon what he's about to say, that Paul never viewed his ministry as exclusive to the Gentiles, but he did understand his particular calling to the Gentiles. And so he mentions, like I said, all facets of the Gentile world, and those are the ones he is indebted to. He's obligated to tell, because that's his particular calling. James Dunn, he said that Paul should be thus prepared to designate the Gentile world in categories of culture and rationality rather than of races or geographical areas is striking. It indicates his confidence in the power of his message, even in the face of Hellenistic sophistication. We saw, just to kind of explain what he's meaning there, we saw in the book of Acts when Paul goes to Athens. Paul goes to Athens, and he's talking to all these philosophers and these people who think themselves to just be so wise, right? And they've got the world just totally figured out. When Paul starts to preach the gospel, they're not necessarily interested in the fact that Jesus came as the promised Messiah and lived a perfect life as God and man, and he died and resurrected again. What they thought is, oh, Paul is introducing some new gods. Well, that's fun, right? Let's learn about these new gods, and we can just add them to our pantheon of gods. And so, Dunn here, he's saying that the gospel is that which negates Hellenistic sophistication. No. He's not just another god to add to the pantheon. He is the God. And his gospel is the only thing that will lead you to heaven. His gospel is the only thing that can level the Greek, the barbarian, the wise, the unwise. We'll see later, the Jew, the Gentile, male, female. None of those things matter in Christ. None of those things matter in Christ. And only the gospel has the ability to do that. And so in light of his obligation, then, Paul writes there, verse 15, he says, so as much as in me is, I am ready. I am ready to preach the gospel to you that are at Rome also. I love the contrast of verse 14 to verse 15. And so verse 14, he says, I'm obligated to do this. And the term obligation, I think, can carry with it the connotation of if I'm obligated to do something, I might not necessarily want to do that thing. I'm obligated to do it, but that's just what I have to do. Maybe not necessarily what I want to do. Well, Paul says in verse 14, no, I'm obligated to do it. By the way, I have a desire to do it. It's a joy to do it. I love to do it. And so verse 14, I'm a debtor. But verse 15, as much as in me is, I am ready. And that term ready there carries with it the connotation of eager. Right? Not just I'm prepared to do it. I have a zeal to go and do it. I don't just have the knowledge to preach the gospel. Man, I have a burning in my soul to preach the gospel. I'm ready to come to you, and I'm ready to preach the gospel to you that are at Rome also. And so he sees his ministry both as an obligation, but also a joy. And so as I was thinking about this, there are aspects of our lives that we can totally relate to this. I have an obligation to love, provide, and care for my family. But that doesn't mean I don't like doing that. I love to provide for and care for my family. It's a joy for me to do that. And so Paul says, yes, the gospel is an obligation that has been laid upon me because of my particular calling of God. But it's such a joy for me to be able to go and to see the fruit that is gained, to see people come to know Christ, to see Christians grow and learn and become more mature in their relationship with Christ. All of these things are wonderful. And even though it's an obligation, it's not something that I dread doing. I love doing it, and I have a zeal to do it, and I will continue to do it. And for Paul, he did until he literally could not do it anymore, because he was martyred. And so for Paul, yes, it was an obligation, but it was also a joy. And so he was eager. He was prepared to do what God called him to do, but he desired to do what God called him to do. Now, I'll just add to this. This is a mark of our own Christian maturity. We're actually going to talk more about this term tonight, but this is what we would refer to as the term of sanctification. Our growth, our maturity as a Christian, and this is a mark of it, that not only are we following the commands of God, but that we take joy in following the commands of God. Right? And so this is, again, a mark of a mature Christian. John tells us in 1 John 5, he says, "For this is the love of God," he says, "that we keep his commandments," and then he adds to that, "and his commandments are not grievous." Right? So not only do we do them, but we don't see them as some burdensome thing. No, it's a joy to follow the law of God. It's a joy to do the things that God asks of us to do. And again, this is a mark of the growth of the believer. Because as we grow, we're getting closer to God. And it's this interesting relationship because we grow in Christ, getting closer to Christ. And the closer we get to Christ, the more we realize how far we are from Christ. The more we realize how holy he is and how sinful we are. And so the closer we get to Christ, the more of the gap we see between us and Christ. And so there should be more of a desire to close that gap, as it were, knowing it will never be closed completely this side of heaven. But there's more of a joy to follow the commands of God, to be in line with the will of God. And so Paul kind of talked about that perfectly there in verses 14 and 15. And so, and before we move on, I want to add this. What is interesting here is that Paul had a desire to preach the gospel specifically to the Romans. Right? Look at verse 15. "So as much as in me is, I am ready to preach the gospel to you that are at Rome also." By saying "to you," the only plain way to take that, the only plain reading of verse 15, is that the "you" there refers to the ones he's writing to. In other words, refers to Christians. And so when he says, "I'm ready to preach the gospel to you, Christians," I find this interesting. And so Paul then, the only way to take this really, is that Paul views the gospel not only as the means to salvation, which obviously it is, but also that which will rightly guide Christians and churches. In other words, what I mean by this is that the moment you get saved, it's not as though the gospel has no more implications for you. It's not as if you have gleaned all that I can because of the gospel, and now I'll just grow on the other doctrines of Christianity and the other biblical doctrines, and I don't really necessarily need the gospel already because I've been saved. No, Paul negates that completely. I'm coming to preach the gospel, and who does he say specifically he's going to preach it to? You, Christians, you at Rome. And so, yes, the gospel saves. Nobody doubts that. No Christian, at least, doubts that. But the gospel also tells us that Christ died to redeem for himself a people that he is actively working to conform to the image of himself. Right? That's what the gospel tells us, is that Christ didn't just die to save a people and then leave them in their sinful state. No, but he saves for himself a people to conform to his image. We'll see a lot more about this as we go through the book of Romans. But in other words, the gospel saves, but the gospel also keeps working on you. It, again, to go back to what we just talked about, it performs sanctification in our life. And it only makes sense because if we truly understand the gospel, then we know what the gospel cost Jesus. We know what it took for Christ to not only give up as far as heaven is concerned and the worship that he had in heaven before he came to earth, but we know what it cost him when he got here. And not just the cross, but the condemnation of those that he came to save. The rejection of those that he loved. As he's on the cross, only John and his mother are there. Everybody else has fled. And so, Peter, the most outspoken of the disciples, just a few hours before, just boldly saying, "I'll go where you go. I'll die if you die. Nobody will ever take me away from you." And then what does Jesus say? "No, before the cock crows 3 times, you're going to deny me." What does he do? He goes and he denies him. And so Jesus, it cost Christ so much more than just the physical pain of crucifixion, which obviously I don't want to negate the physical pain of it. It was so vast, I don't even think we can begin to understand the amount of physical pain that Jesus endured at Calvary. But the cost of our salvation was far more than just the physical side of it. There was a spiritual pain, there was rejection, there was all the things that Jesus endured and gave up just to come to earth in the first place. You go back to and I'm spending more time here than I intended, but you go back to Isaiah, and Isaiah gets this vision, and the angels in heaven are doing what? They're falling down and they're worshiping, crying out, holy, holy, holy. They're worshiping Christ. And so Jesus gave up the worship of his creation to come and be a part of his creation, to be denied and rejected by his creation. All of this just so that you could have the free gift of salvation. And so Paul sees here, then the preaching of the gospel is not just to save a person. It obviously does that. But it's also to conform that person to Christ. It's also to keep working on that individual. And so the gospel has many, many implications. And so that naturally then brings us to the next two verses where I'll spend the rest of my time this morning. And we talked about this in the introduction, that these two verses kind of serve as the theme statement of the book of Romans. And so what I believe that Paul is doing here is that verse 17 kind of closes out what you might refer to as the introductory material. And so he ends his introduction with, here's what this letter is going to be all about. And then he spends the next 15 and a half chapters describing this and its implications. And so these two verses, in my opinion, serve as the theme statement of the whole book. And so verse 16, he says, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God unto salvation to everyone that believeth, to the Jew first, and also to the Greek." So we'll pause there just for a moment. And so what we have here in verses 16 and 17 are a series of statements. A series of statements that each one kind of builds upon the last. And so he's laying, to use the language, he's laying a foundation, and then he's building on top of that foundation with each passing statement. So the first statement he gives there at the beginning, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ." And so he just told them in verses 14 and 15, I'm coming to preach the gospel. I'm obligated to do so. It's a joy to do so. And why is it a joy? Why is it a joy for him? Why is he eager to come preach the gospel? Well, first of all, because he's not ashamed of it. He's not ashamed of the gospel of Christ. Now, to us, to some, I might say, this might seem like a strange statement. Why does Paul need to write, as a Christian, to a group of Christians, that he's not ashamed of it? The reason is a little bit lost in time. And here's what I mean by this. The gospel is predicated on what? The gospel is predicated on the life, death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. So the gospel is predicated on a Jewish rabbi suffering the Roman death of crucifixion. Obviously, these things aren't done anymore. We don't see people getting crucified anymore. And even if we did, it would not carry the connotations that it did in first century Rome. Crucifixion was a shameful death, to the point that if you were a natural-born citizen, it was illegal for you to be crucified, because we don't do that to our own. We don't go so low as to crucify a Roman citizen. That's only for foreigners. That's only for those beneath us. And yet, that is the thing that the Christians were saying, this is our greatest hope. Everything that we believe is based upon what you see as shameful. And so here Paul is saying, I'm not ashamed. I'm not ashamed of the gospel. He tells the Corinthians in 1 Corinthians 1, he says, but we preach Christ crucified. He says, unto the Jews it's a stumbling block. And he says, but unto the Greeks it's foolishness. They can't understand why we take such pride and joy in the fact that our Savior died on a Roman cross for us. It makes no sense to them. Let me give you an example of this. There is sitting right now today in the Palatine Museum in Rome, there is a piece of a wall. They removed this piece. There was a piece of a wall where originally this wall sat near Palatine Hill in Rome, and somebody around the 3rd century, they don't know exactly when, but they estimate somewhere around the 3rd century, somebody came and they scratched some graffiti onto this wall. And so they cut that piece of wall off and they put it in the Palatine Museum. But that graffiti depicts a man on a cross with the head of a donkey, and then right next to the cross is a man with at least one arm upraised, and underneath that cross is a depiction which says Alexamenus worships his God. But what do they depict him as? as a man with the head of a donkey. Why? Because that's shameful. They're mocking this man Alexamenos. Look how ridiculous his faith is. Look how ridiculous his religion is. He would go so far as to worship a man who died on a cross. It makes no sense to them. To the Greeks, it's what? It's foolishness. And so Paul says, I'm not ashamed of it. I'm not ashamed of it, and you shouldn't be either. And so this is, despite what the Jews believed as far as a stumbling block, it was a stumbling block to them because their Messiah they didn't think should die. Right? No, he's coming to conquer. He's not coming to be conquered. Right? And so to them it's a stumbling block. To the Greeks it's foolishness. They can't understand why that would be a joy to Christians. And so despite what the Jews or the Greeks thought about the crucified Jesus, Paul was not ashamed not only to preach that man, to preach the cross, but to say that that was God on that cross. God himself came down and endured the shame of the cross. I'm not ashamed of it. And so he tells them, first of all, why am I so eager? Because number one, I'm not ashamed of it. And then Paul is not ashamed of the gospel. One of the reasons why he's not is because, number two, it is the power of God unto salvation to everyone that believeth, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. So I'm eager. Yes, I'm indebted, but I'm eager. Why? I'm not ashamed of it. Why am I not ashamed of it? Because it's the power of God unto salvation. And so the gospel has power to save. Now, why does that matter? The gospel has power to save. This matters for us because it tells us that when somebody gets saved, when an individual comes to Christ, it had nothing to do with the eloquence of the preacher. It had nothing to do with the cleverness of the presentation. It had everything to do with the actual content of the gospel. Right? A preacher can get up and wax eloquent all day long. That doesn't mean that people are going to get saved. Somebody can come up with the most clever presentation anybody ever heard of the gospel, but that doesn't mean somebody's going to get saved. But if somebody believes in the gospel, they have been saved. And so it being the gospel, it is the power to save. And so the power is that which changes a person from enemy to friend, from sinner to righteous, from guilty to innocent, from a heart of stone to a heart of flesh. I can't do that. You can't do that. Nobody else can do that. Only God can through the gospel. Furthermore, it has the power to save. Now look at this. Let me explain what I'm about to say. And so it says, for it is the power of God unto salvation to everyone that believeth. And so it has the power to save those that believe. And so the gospel is limited in this way. Now let me explain what I mean. It is not limited in its ability to save. It is universal in its ability. It is limited in its scope. Here's what I mean by that. How does one get to heaven? How does one enjoy Christ forever? Not everybody's going to enjoy this. I am the way, the truth, and life. No one comes to the Father but by me. And so the gospel is limited, not in its ability to save, but the gospel is limited in its scope, meaning it is limited by what? It's limited by faith. The gospel is only coming to those who have faith. The power to save only changes those, only saves those who have faith. God is not, let's put it this way. God is not going to send a person to heaven to enjoy Christ forever who has chosen to reject Christ in this life. In other words, you have proved with every day you have lived that you don't want Christ, so why do you want him there? No, you have chosen what it is you wanted. You have wanted, by the way that you have lived, a life separate from Christ. And that's what you're going to get. And so it's limited by faith. Douglas Moo, he said, to believe is to put full trust in the God who justifies the ungodly. We'll see that in chapter 4. By means of the cross and resurrection of Christ. Though intellectual assent cannot be excluded from faith, the Pauline emphasis is on surrender to God as an act of the will. Pauline faith, or New Testament faith, is not primarily agreement with the set of doctrines, but trust in a person. And it is that trust in that person that saves. Again, not the preacher, not the eloquence, none of that. It is the trust in that person. And it is only those who have that trust in that person who will experience the saving power of the gospel. All that to say, the gospel is not universal. Not everybody is going to experience heaven. This is a dangerous doctrine. The doctrine that says, live how you want. At the end of the day, God's not going to condemn anybody to hell, is a dangerous doctrine, because what it tells you is that you can live however you want in rejection of the one who died for you for your entire life, and then just get some kind of free pass to go enjoy him forever. That's not what the Bible teaches. And so he's not ashamed of the gospel. Why? He's not ashamed because it's power. The gospel is the power to save, but it's only the power to save those who believe. And then he has this at the end of verse 16, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. Now, this is, I think people make more of this than what it is. It's really rather simple. To the Jew first is simply a reference to the fact that the gospel came from Jews. They were God's people. They produced a Jewish Messiah. The Jewish Messiah then gave the gospel to Jews, who then started the first church made up of what? Of Jews. And then from that came the gospel going out to the Gentiles and to the church that we know today. But to the Jew first simply just shows us essentially the gospel's origin. And so to the Jew first and also to the Greek. However, Jew or Gentile, again, faith is the key. It doesn't matter your nationality. It doesn't matter your ethnicity. Faith is what matters. Faith is what brings salvation. Faith is what brings the power of the gospel to save. And so why is the gospel the power to save those who believe? It says, for therein is the righteousness of God revealed from faith to faith. This is the beginning of verse 17. Again, Moody said, for Paul, as in the Old Testament, righteousness of God is a relational concept, bringing together the aspects of activity and status. We can define it as the act by which God brings people into right relationship with himself. And so the beginning of verse 17, for therein is the righteousness of God revealed from faith to faith. I'll tell you this. There's a couple of phrases in verse 17 that are some of the most debated in the entire book of Romans. That three little word phrase there, righteousness of God, and then again from faith to faith. These are highly, highly debated. However, I agree with Moo. Essentially, the righteousness of God here likely refers both to the work of God of saving the sinner, but also the status of the newly saved individuals. Another way to say that, God's righteousness both saves us, but it also makes us righteous, right? And so his righteousness saves us, and then we now get, and we'll see this more in chapter 4, we now get what is called the imputation. God's righteousness is essentially taken and placed upon us, and so that now we legally stand as though we are as righteous as Christ. Even though we're not, we have been legally made as such. And so the righteousness of God, I believe, both saves and changes. It saves and makes us, in status, it makes us righteous. And then the phrase from faith to faith. Again, I'm not going to go into all the weeds of this, but it's just very, very, very debated. And there are so many different interpretations that have been given of this. But what seems to me to be the most consistent view is that righteousness comes by faith and faith alone. By faith and faith alone. It's not faith plus or minus anything. It is faith and faith alone. Matthew Poole said it this way, he saith not from faith to works or from works to faith, but from faith to faith, i.e. only by faith. And I agree. I think that's what Paul is saying here. Now, to bolster his thought then, Paul gives what might be an unusual Old Testament quotation. And so he says at the end of verse 17, he says, as it is written, the just shall live by faith. Now, we all would agree with that statement, right? Nobody disagrees with that statement. But the question is, why is Paul quoting that particular verse? This quotation comes from the book of Habakkuk. In Habakkuk chapter 2, verse number 4. Now, as a little information, Habakkuk, it's a very, very fascinating, very relatable, in fact, maybe the most relatable of all the minor prophets. Habakkuk is getting the revelation of God that the Babylonians are going to come as a means of God's judgment to judge the nation of Judah. So God gives Habakkuk this revelation, and Habakkuk acts in what I would say a very human way. Habakkuk kind of throws a fit about it. Habakkuk says, but God, why? Why would you use a sinful nation to judge sinners? It doesn't make sense to me. And he goes on to say, if you let Babylon do this, then they're just going to keep getting power, and they're just going to be sinful for a long time to come. And it doesn't make sense, and it doesn't seem just, and I don't understand why you would do this. And so God eventually just kind of rebukes Habakkuk a little bit and says, listen, what you need to understand is their judgment's coming too. But it's coming on my time. I decide when these judgments happen, not you, Habakkuk. So all you need to do is sit back and have faith that what I say is going to happen is going to happen. And so the just must live by faith of the promises of God. That's the context of what of the quotation that Paul gives there. Or, here's why I think he gives this. I think you could say it this way. Living in right relationship with God requires faith. If you're not living, God speaking to Habakkuk, if you're not living in right relationship with me, you're not going to have the faith required to see that, yes, your judgment is coming because you deserve it, but then also their judgment is coming because they also deserve it. But if I want to choose to use them as a means to judge you, as sovereign God, I have every right to do it, and just have faith that their judgment is going to come just on the day it should. The just should live by faith. So faith, then, is the means not only of our justification, but faith is the means of our righteous living. We are saved by faith, but we also live by faith. And so this is, and there's a difference, by the way. There's a difference in what we might refer to as salvific faith, the faith that saves. And there's a difference in kind of the practical everyday living by faith. And so this is, I believe this is what Paul is telling them. Therein is the righteousness of God. That's salvation. That's the new status revealed from faith to faith. As it is written, the just shall live by faith. Matthew Henry said, those that are made just by faith shall live, shall be happy here and forever. While they are here, they live by it. And when they come to heaven, faith shall be swallowed up in vision. But while we are here, we live by it, from faith to faith. Faith alone. Faith saves. It is faith that should help us to live righteously. So, in conclusion this morning, to quote Thomas Constable, he said, verses 16 and 17, obviously I agree, are the key verses in Romans because they state the theme of the revelation that follows. Paul's message was the gospel. He felt no shame declaring it, but was eager to proclaim it because it was a message that can deliver everyone who believes it from God's wrath. It is a message, now get this, it is a message of how a righteous God righteously makes people righteous. So let me read that again. It is a message how a righteous God righteously makes people righteous. So the theme of the gospel is the righteousness of God, and the theme of Romans is the gospel. Paul desperately wanted to go to Rome to continue his work in spreading this powerful gospel and showing the Roman Christians how faith not only justifies us, but faith is that which spurs us to right or righteous living. Solomon says in the book of Proverbs to trust on yourself, but to lean on God, right? Don't follow your own understanding. And listen, that's something that's easy to say, real difficult to do. And so here Paul is telling them, faith has justified you. It has made you a Christian. It has made you a child of God. It has taken you from enemy to friend, all the things we talked about. But faith is also that which will lead you to live righteously, to live in the manner that a Christian ought to live. And so why does this matter for us? What's kind of the practical application of this? To know the gospel is to know the God of the gospel. To know we are justified by faith is to know what it cost Christ. We talked about that earlier. To know that faith brings salvation is to know that salvation brings faith. And by that I mean salvation produces within us that desire to live righteously. In other words, to better know the gospel brings us closer to our Savior and shows us how to live. And this is why I said earlier, for Christians, the gospel is not just the thing that saves you. It is the thing that will keep you living righteously. Always to think back to Calvary. To think back to, as Brother Lynn just sang about it, but think back to the nails. Think back to the crown of thorns. Think back to the beating. Think back to the rejection. Think back to all the things that Christ sacrificed, not just his body, but everything that Christ sacrificed to give you hope, to give you a chance, to give you a free gift of grace, to give us the opportunity to live with him for eternity, to praise him and worship him for what he's done for us. And all of this should bring us closer. It should mature us. It should sanctify us. And it should cause us to live righteously. And so I'll close with what Paul said. For therein is the righteousness of God revealed from faith to faith. Let's close in prayer.